Good afternoon, everybody. It's Frank here from Grace Explain, and today's topic is going to be an interesting one. I'm going to look at this phrase from Jesus in Luke chapter 12, verse 32, where he says, "Have no fear, little flock, because the Father has promised to give you the kingdom." I think something, just paraphrasing, but now it's a pithy statement he makes, and it's a really encouraging statement if you understand the context of why he's saying it and whereabouts he's saying it. We'll get that in a moment. The reason why I bring that up to you today was because initially I was going to talk about the 144,000, and what is that? Is that symbolic, literal? How should we read that? But as I was thinking about it, and then putting my JW mind at work, or as a Jehovah's Witness, has how they would answer that, I realized that they would actually go back a little bit earlier to what Jesus says, and that's probably the start of their explaining that there would be a two-class system. Now, of course, when you think of Jehovah's Witnesses and a two-class system, that is unique to them. It is also unique to a dispensationalist who believe that that group, 144,000, is literal Jews. Okay, that's the other assertion out there. And then there's the Jews and Gentiles, I guess, combined. But that's another topic for another discussion, okay? But for a Jehovah's Witness for the last 80 years, I say 80 years because they didn't always believe in a two-class system. They didn't always believe that there would be some living on earth as subjects without a covenant, and some living in heaven, ruling from heaven with a covenant. They never always used to believe that. They used to believe the opposite. They used to believe that all were in a covenant and that they would all be in heaven. But the year 1935 changed that. And ever since then, that's what they've been preaching to people. That's their gospel. And that's false. Now, I did a video earlier on the other sheep doctrine as it rolled out in 1935, and how they themselves, the governing body, have debunked their own teaching. And it's very interesting discussion. I have it. I'll put it in the link down the bottom. But today's topic, we're going to look at the little flock. Let's break it down bit by bit so we can understand where a Jehovah's Witness is coming from, and how we can really explain to them, or let them explain to themselves, what actually this means, what Jesus says in Luke chapter 12. What is he actually saying? And so, have no fear, little flock. That's what Jesus' encouraging words are. Why would he say that? Well, how has the Watchtower taught it to its members? And you can see the psychology when they, because of their two-tiered system, how they need to convince their own members that there is a two-class system, a two-tiered system scripturally, even though it's not true. But they need to convince them. In 1980, July 15, 1980, here's a depiction of this, quote, "Jehovah's arrangement for his sheep, the great majority of the sheep are outside the sheepfold." If that was the case in 1980, it certainly was, okay, so certainly more so today. It brings to mind Matthew 9:36. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. Okay, so how did the division in that Jehovah God, the Good Shepherd, flock, came to be divided into two classes? Now, I've alluded to that. The faithful slave, as we know, the governing body, that's what they identify themselves as. In 1930s, under the then ruling president, Rutherford, he worked out that the 144,000 had to be literal, was a literal number. Now, previous to 1935, they used to teach that there was 144,000, and then there was another other group, the other great multitude, but they would all be in heaven, right? But that number, because they were, for whatever reason, whatever his ideas were and why he came to that conclusion, that was a literal number, and that this other crowd in Revelation was not supposed to be in heaven but on earth, living on earth. And of course, by 1930s, if you count from 33 CE, the total number of 144,000, if you're taking that literally, was fulfilled, was more than fulfilled, way past that number, right? So this was a new light that came out in the convention in 1935 saying that number is filled, basically, because after 1935, believe it or not, there were no more appointments for anointed people. If you put your hand up and said after 1935, hey, I have a heavenly calling, in their minds, a Jehovah's Witness mind, the only reason why that would happen was somebody who was anointed was unfaithful, and so there was a slot open for you to take. And that's the only reason they came up with for that person, whoever they were, to partake of the emblems. But like I said, I'll put a link in the discussion so you can look at that doctrine and how they themselves, the governing body, have debunked their own doctrine. So this little flock, Jehovah's Witnesses, before making their doctrine stick with these two separate classes, they would normally read, if I was witnessing to somebody, I would start off by reading Luke 12:32. And when you look at the Watchtower library, it's interesting, they always inverted commas. You'll always see little flock, inverted commas. They don't explain anything else. They just pick a couple of words. That's what they want you to get in your head. Just the little flock. Focus on that. Don't worry about what Jesus says around that, right? It's not important. So this is where where Jesus said, "Do not be afraid, little flock. Your Father has pleased to give you the kingdom." Then you would take somebody, if you're a JW, you would take them to Revelation 7:4, which says, "Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from the tribes of Israel." You would take that literally, even though the book of Revelation is a book of symbols. If you read further down, as you start to read, they will skip the 12 tribes of Israel. Why? Because, see, in their understanding, those 12 tribes are symbolic. That's right. So you go literal, symbolic. Then when it's finished, it talks about, then look, I see a great multitude. That's what the angel says, or that's how it's described. So that great multitude now is in contrast, not to the 12 tribes, because that's symbolic. That has to be contrasted to this literal number. So therefore, that great crowd is literal. Okay? And so that's how they interpret that. And then they say that crowd is from the earth. And these ones come through the tribulation, and then these ones are not children of God. They are friends of God who will live on as the nucleus of a new world society moving forward, right? That's how they teach that. And then they'll say about the anointed, the 144,000, who are the anointed? These are spiritual Israel. And of course, then they'll go to Revelation 14, which says, "Then look, and before me was the Lamb, and with him 144,000." Right? So then they'll try and back that up again, saying, there you see. So there you go, right? That's what they'll say. The focus is always on the two words, though, little flock, and then the great crowd. Little flock is separate to the great crowd. Never the same, because When they read the book of Revelation, they're taking bits and pieces to mean literal, symbolic, literal, figurative, literal, right? That's how they do it. Interesting quote from Watchtower 10, just to show how they group these words together. It says, Jesus also taught that there would be others who would rule with him in the kingdom. Luke 22, 28-30. He called these co-rulers, a little flock, for their number would be limited. He said to them, your Father has approved of giving you the kingdom. Interesting wording. Your Father has approved of you giving you the kingdom. The King James Version says, your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. See the difference? Approved means, like you've ticked all the boxes. You've been approved. You've been a good boy, Johnny. We'll give you the kingdom. But they forget there's a little word there that says give, or in their translation says giving you the kingdom. So you got to remember the New World Translation is a biased translation. I'm just going to say that from the outset. Let's continue on with the quote. It says, the last book of the Bible shows there will be a total of 144,000 who will have the privilege of ruling with Christ. It doesn't say that it's a privilege, although I'm sure it is. No, God's not saying, hey, you should be, you should be thankful, right? That you're even getting a chance to rule with Jesus. How thankful should you be? Jehovah's Witnesses have been wrongly taught by the Watchtower there are two flocks with two destinations. One flock to heaven and the other on earth as subjects to the little flock. And that's what they teach, but that's wrong. To divert attention from the real question, the September 1, 1998 Watchtower states this: some have questioned whether it's fair that some have a heavenly hope while others have an earthly hope. No. We don't question whether it's fair, right? We want to know, is it scriptural? Forget about how you feel about the thing. Is it scriptural, friends? Witnesses are told in the Watchtower, February 15, 1986, page 14, the other sheep do not need any such rebirth, for their goal is life everlasting in the restored paradise, on this restored earthly paradise as subjects of the kingdom. The Watchtower says that those with an earthly hope are not jealous of those with a heavenly hope. Again, this is not the point. Why even say things like this? The point is whether it is scriptural. You see what they're doing? They know that there's problems with his teaching. Why would you say that? If there was, what, is God trying to cause issues with his own flock? Right? Maybe the whole thing is wrong, you see. Maybe that's probably more why, but they don't want to get to that point. They just want you to accept. Don't get emotional about it. Don't think there's divisions. Just be happy with whichever class you're in. Some are tagged to be in heaven, and some are tagged, the majority are tagged to be on earth. Be grateful. That's what they're saying to you. So you go from Luke 12:32 to Revelation 7, which is the 144,000. Then they say you are united together at John 10:16. That's the other verse. As one flock, although they are heading into two different destinations, one with a covenant made and other not yet. You let that sink in for a moment, okay? But John 10:16, when you read it, actually says the opposite if you read the whole context. Jesus says, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and they shall be one flock and one shepherd. Notice, one flock, not two flocks, one flock and only one shepherd. So what justification is there for connecting the three together, and John 10:16 with the 144,000 in the book of Revelation. There's none, right? Interestingly, if you look at what Paul said, he nicely captures what Jesus says in John 10:16 when he says to the Gentiles in Ephesians chapter 2, 11 to 22, he says, "Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once very far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. For he has made the two one, and has destroyed the barrier, thus making peace, and in this one body, to reconcile both them to God through the cross." So the two groups that Jesus was talking about in John 10:16 are the believing Jews and the believing Gentiles, or the people of the nations, as the Watchtower likes to call them, who are brought together into one flock, John 10:16, as the gospel message should go out and should be very clear. So what can we say? There is actually no mention of the 144,000 is literal at all. I believe it's symbolic, but I'll get to that in another discussion. There is no connection to the one flock, or the little flock, sorry. The 144,000 are described only twice in Revelation 7 and 14, and the little flock appears once in chapter 12 of Luke, and we should look at the context, and we'll get that in a moment. The Watchtower connects the little flock with 144,000. Why? What's the point of that? It's to convince their members they are one of the same, right? A literal number capped off at 144,000, which was basically capped off in 1935, according to their sources, that is Rutherford's, which is a reference to the anointed, of course. It should be noted that these terms do not appear together or are related in that way as the Watchtower relates in the Bible. So you notice how Jehovah's Witnesses will hopscotch or jump from one text to another, one part of the Bible to another, asserting without proof that these are referring to one group, but different destinations with different covenants, one with a covenant, one without. So what's the best way to handle this? The best way is always context. Always stop a witness, and if you're a Jehovah's Witness, stop and ask yourself, what does the context say? When I read Luke 12:32, what is the context? Well, I'm going to get to that now. And why does the flock of God struggle with fear? So why is Christ saying to those in his disciples, fear not? Obviously, there was reasons why he said that they would be in fear. Okay, so he points to a lot of things. In verse 4, he tells, now in verse 1, I should say, let's go back to as he opens up in Luke 12, he starts off by saying, in the meantime, when the crowd had gathered together in so many thousands, they were stepping upon one another, and he started by saying first to his disciples, before he speaks to the crowd. So as you read through this book, this chapter, and he goes on to 13, etc., you've got to realize you've got to pick the audience. Who is Jesus saying these words to? Because not everything is directed to you as a believer. Some things are said to unbelievers, and they're scary thoughts. But first off, he talks about watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees which is hypocrisy. Okay? Then he says in verse 4, I do say to you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body. After this, they are not able to do anything more. So you start to see now, he starts to bring up fear early. Then in verse 11 he says, and when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious or what you are to answer or what you are to say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you what to say. So Jesus implies that we are prone to fear publicly, especially if we're put on notice, right? Then in 22 he says, maybe we'll read this bit here because 32 is in that context. So let's go to Luke chapter 12 and do a bit of Bible reading from 22, because up to this point now he talks about someone who stores up treasures, with possessions. And now he turns in verse 22, then he says this, then he says to his disciples. So we know now immediately in this context he's going to talk to the disciples. He says, on this account I say to you, quit being anxious about your souls as to what you will eat, and your bodies as to what you will wear. For the soul is worth more than the food, and the body than clothing. Mark well the ravens, neither sow seed nor reap, and they have neither barn nor storehouses, yet God feeds them. Of how much more worth are you than birds? Who of you, being anxious, can add a cubit to his lifespan? If therefore you cannot do the least thing, why be anxious about the remaining things? Mark well about the lilies, how they grow, neither toil nor spin. But I tell you, not even Solomon in all his glory was arrayed as one of these. If now God thus clothes the vegetation in the field, and today exists and tomorrow is cast in the oven, how much rather will he clothe you with little faith? So quit seeking what you might eat and what you might drink, and quit being anxious. For all these things the nations of the world are eagerly pursuing, but your Father knows you need these things. Nevertheless, seek continually his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. I am reading from the New World Translation here. Have no fear, little flock, because your Father has approved of giving you the kingdom. And then he says, sell the things belonging to you and gifts of mercy. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, and never failing treasures in the heavens, where a thief does not get nor a moth consumes, for where your treasure is, your heart will be also. So there's a lot to compact in here, but we're just going to focus on the one verse that they use out of context. The rest can be a discussion for yourself, but this is a very encouraging point that Jesus is making. As you can see, from the beginning, he's bringing out fear, anxiety, right? Shame that they would go through. And for them not to have fear, because the King James says, I've made a little board here just to give me some pointers. King James says, fear not, little flock, for your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So what is Jesus saying? And this is really an encouragement for us even today. Okay? Even today. Well, first off, he says, fear not. We can break this down into two sections. Fear not, little flock. Why? Your Father, for your Father, this word for, why? I'll just put here why. You don't need to fear. Because your Father's good pleasure is to what? To give you the kingdom. So when we look at this, what is Jesus saying to his disciples when we think about it? After everything he's just said to these men, there's a lot he said in there. There's a lot of packages you can look through in Luke chapter 12, and I encourage you to read it a whole lot. But you'll see then in the middle there, he gives this pointer. Why don't they have to fear? Fear not. You can use other words for fear when you think about fear, anxiety, etc., whatever scares you, right? Why shouldn't you fear? Well, he says little flock. Notice he calls them a little flock. So if they're a flock, that means they're the sheep, as we know, and a sheep with a shepherd. Now, who's the shepherd? He says, for your father. He's the shepherd. He's not the type of shepherd. Your father, he's not the boss like an employer, an employee. No. So he's trying to encourage them, right? You guys are sheep. You're little. Does that mean number? It could mean number, right? Obviously, with a great crowd there, there were thousands there, his disciples were just a little flock standing next to him, right? That's his audience. But also, when you think of sheep and little, there are terms of endearment, are they? Terms of, what did I put here? Affection and care. So, little flock, they're vulnerable, they're small, they're weak, they're not that powerful. Strong flock, powerful flock. He doesn't call them that, but little flock, right? Just think of what he's saying to them. Think of everything they've just heard from Jesus about losing your life, being thrown in the synagogues, and all this other stuff, right? That they could have caused anxiety. And he says, don't worry about, your Father looks after the lilies in the field and the birds. How much more so for you? Don't have that fear. Where's your faith, right? Little faith. You with little faith. Have faith. But that's this point, right? So little to me can mean two things. A small number, but in the context, more likely he's talking about them being vulnerable, being weak, not being very powerful, need reassurance. So he's given them reassurance. Well, we know with the flock, there's a shepherd. And then he's saying, well, he's not just anybody that's the good shepherd. It's the Father, right? He's not your boss. No, he's your Father. And then he says, with good pleasure. Here's some of the reasons, right? Don't have fear. He says he will give you a kingdom. So you don't have to worry about all your material things. You've got the Father's kingdom. But when you think about the kingdom, if you split up that word, you have the word king comes into it, right? So not only is the Father a shepherd, he's the Father, but he's also a king. So now, in their mind, they're developing reassurance, reasons not to fear God. I put here that he takes good pleasure to give you. So in other words, if he's giving these disciples part of his domain as the king, they're going to be co-rulers. He's not saying that they need to work for it. He's not saying, as the Watchtower says, they're approved. Good pleasure. They're approved for it. No, because approval means you need to do something. It's not about what you do. Paul says that it's not about your works that you're being saved. That's not even in it. You see, the Father doesn't have any motives to give you this. That's what he's saying. There's no works. You don't have to barter for it. You don't have to work hard to get into it or to have partake of it or to be for the Father to do this. Why? Because it says there, because of his good pleasure. You see, he's not stingy, right? Or as the Watchtower says, approved. No, the good pleasure. He wants to. That's what he's saying. He wants to do this for you, right? He wants to give you part of his kingdom. He's going to give it to you. So when you look at it, what is he saying? He's saying you don't have to fear. Why? Because here's your reasons. You're assured. Your assurance is that the shepherd is the Father. He's also the king. And he gives you the reasons for it. He also takes delight to give you, right? You're not buying into it. You're not doing anything to get it. He's giving you the kingdom. And really, it comes at a great cost to the Father because the Son had to die. And yet, he's gladly doing this. So he's trying to reassure the disciples that they are secure, that they're safe, they don't have to stress, they don't have to be anxious, they don't have to worry about the future or their future. Do you see what he's saying? And the Watchtower butchers this up because they teach Jehovah's Witnesses to look at focusing on two words to make a point about a separate group of people. They forget about everything that Jesus has just said there. They don't even think that. You see how they've taken a doctrine, taken Jesus' words and made a doctrine out of something that has no meaning to the context at all. Nothing at all. So instead of looking at it in an encouraging light, they look at it like a math equation. Oh, well, there's a little flock. Must be the 144,000. That's what it means. That's who this group is. Don't worry about what it says everything else, right? Don't worry about anything else it says. Just let's move forward to proving that this little flock is 144,000 is the anointed, but not anybody else. It really misses what it's saying, what Jesus is saying. And because you get fixated on the number, that's all you see when you see little. You see, instead of looking at it in the light that I think Jesus is trying to teach his disciples, that in a loving, compassionate way, hey, little flock, you're the little flock. You don't have to fear, right? There's a shepherd, you're a sheep. We know that you're not strong and powerful, so you don't have to fear. Why? Because the Father, with his good pleasure, he loves to do this for you. He wants to do this. He's going to give you, because he's the king and he's got a kingdom, he's going to give you the kingdom. He's not asking anything of you. Just, obviously, as we've learnt, it's just believing in Jesus. That's the only work that was required. That's what Jesus said in John chapter 6. You see what it's saying? Have no fear, little flock. I think that's what I think that's what Jesus is saying. You might think differently. If you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're listening to this, please take time and read the context. Read it in the light that Jesus is saying what this means. And don't jump to another book and another book to try and make connections of a doctrine that is faulty. The 1935 introduction of another group by the Society or the Watchtower back then is not scriptural. It's completely false. And unless you take the time out to discover why, you'll always be out of a covenant. And it's not a gospel that you can actually rightly preach and convince people of when there's no basis for it. You're preaching a false gospel, friend, and I mean that sincerely. Have a look at my description below on the topic of the great multitude as was brought out by Rutherford in 1935. So take your time. Have a read of Luke chapter 12. It's actually quite an encouraging statement. It's a very pithy statement, but it's an encouraging one, especially in these times with the pandemic and people aren't sure about themselves and they're anxious about a lot of things. Read through that and meditate. Take time to meditate on what Christ is saying, because it actually is quite faith strengthening for all believers today, I believe, especially this current climate. Thanks for your time, guys. I hope that makes sense about how Jehovah's Witnesses jump from one point to another point to another point to make a doctrine, a false doctrine, stick. The best thing to do is stop them and say, what does the context say? Right? Just what does the context say? Get them to read it and stop and ask questions. Look at those words. Stop and ask those questions about those words. What does it actually mean, little flock? It could mean a number, or it could mean something else in context, right? And break it all down. Maybe something like what I just did there, in your own words, and you'll be surprised. Maybe someone will take heed. Thanks again, and have a great week. And I will come up with the 144,000. As I'm saying, I believe it's symbolic, and I'll explain why. See you later. Take care.